Hello, and thank you very much for clicking on this session, Introduction to Research Methods and Methodologies. I'm Sam Newington, and I'm an academic skills tutor located in the Writing Centre as part of the University of Liverpool. Today, what I'd like to consider are not just methods and methodology, but the application of such constructs within your academic studies and indeed the final research project process as well. And so the agenda for this session includes an overview of the final research project process. What is the difference between research methodologies and methods? So often we use these terms interchangeably, but in actual fact there are core distinctions between these terminologies. What is theoretical? What are theories? What are universals? What are ways in which we can apply process and methods and methodology? So hopefully this session will just navigate some of the core distinctions and approaches that you could use as part of your research that culminates into the drafting of your final research project. Now, two particular approaches that I'd like to talk about today are quantitative and qualitative. And again, really defining what do these mean? How is one, say, something that's measurable, and how is one the other a conceptual framework? All these sorts of things. So what are the distinctions between these approaches, and how can they be utilized and inform your own research? The next point I'd like to consider is choosing a methodology dependent upon your subject area and the topic of which you'll be looking at. We need to ensure that you apply appropriate methodological considerations. And here it may be something too that you'd like to discuss with your advisor. But part of the final research project, of course, is thinking about not just methodologies and methods, theories and theoretical approaches, but also principally is setting an appropriate research question. And so what we've got here within this presentation are sample questions that can kind of just help us to think about how we may construct an inquiry. I will further look at common pitfalls, the pros and cons. So the first part of this presentation are going to be all the positive, proactive ways in which we can engage the processes of research and methodologies, etc. But then there's going to be just some slight top tips about, okay, these are the approaches, but this is what you need to do. Be mindful not to kind of go in this direction. And so just some top tips of navigation there. With all research projects, of course, and inquiries, ethical considerations need to be built into the research design, and that will be another topic for discussion. Further aspects that I'd like to look at are summary and top tips, questions and answers, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in just a moment. Okay, so the final research project process. This is an exciting moment where you, as the researcher, are looking into a particular area. You are collating data of synthesis, academic, as well as potentially vocational-based research. You are essentially contributing a dialogue within the field of study. But there, like any writing, with any forms of study, consider this a process. Not everything is going to write up the night before submission. It's a process. In actual fact, the principal process, I would argue, is not entirely the writing up phase, but in actual fact, the approaches and considerations that you need to think about in order to write up your final project. And so think about the research area in which you are engaging, identify a gap in the literature, select a topic of interest. And so there is another recording about literature review and how to approach literature. But of course, as we're looking into the field of study, we're looking at areas in which to progress the dialogue. And so perhaps look at an area that needs fuller and further discussion, or perhaps has received a complete omission of discussion discussion within the academic discourse. And so your final research project can come in at a number of levels. And so do make sure that when you pick your topic, it's from an informed basis, that you are aware of the academic discourse and dialogue within the community of study, so that to be sure that you pick a topic area that is relevant and pertinent, certainly at this postgraduate level. So once you've had a, if you like, a rummage around at the subject areas, you've picked a topic, think about the methodology and methods that you will choose in or and engage with in order to draft and approach your topic area. Now, all of these stages are essentially not just a solo journey with you going through these stages, but please do enter into a dialogue with your advisor, who likewise is an expert in the field of study, and so that you can talk through methodology and methods that you may or are considering to utilize in order to respond to your subject area. But further considerations in terms of the process of a final research project include ethical approval. And of course, there's a comprehensive document that you will be expected to complete to ensure that the ethical declaration approval is had, and that is absolutely crucial. So as I say, there are a number of processes in terms of administrative processes to the final research project, as well as research processes. So, okay, you found a gap in the scholarship. You've kind of got an idea about methodology and methods that you may engage with. You've got the ethical approval. Well, this is where I suppose the work begins. You need to more fully research and analyze findings based on, if you like, depending on the methodology, depending on the quantitative or qualitative approaches that you've engaged. You need to synthesize, articulate your approaches with those that have been had within a broader scholarship of your field of study. From your research and analysis of findings, and again, depending on your methodological approach here, you need to write up the results of that in an articulate synthesis of analysis. Okay, it's not just kind of describing, but analysis, and to some extent, depending, of course, your discipline area, an interpretive framework of those results as well. But okay, you've decided the various kind of layouts of your research. So you've got your introduction, you have, for example, thought about the various chapters that are going to form that final research project, and you've written it up. In actual fact, the initial write-up is just one part of the process. It's incredibly important to edit and revise your writing, because sometimes we can get quite involved in what we're writing up, that we're actually speaking to ourselves on the page and not necessarily to the broader readership that will kind of interact with our work. And so it's important to put things aside and then go back and revise to be sure, and ask ourselves questions about our own research writing, as we would ask questions about literature or scholarship more generally. Is my thesis statement clear? Are my aims and objectives coherent, clear, and relevant? Is my rationale firmly articulated? Are my chapters interconnected thematically or otherwise? Have I utilized appropriate methodological approaches? Have I understood appropriately the methodological approach that I'm applying here and applied it appropriately? So in actual fact, the editing and revising stage is quite involved as a part of the process, because it's not only just what you've written, but the presentational format of what you've written as well that's important. Are my chapters clear? Are my paragraph constructions coherent? Is there a firm line of argument that is being consistently run through the material? Are my conclusions appropriate interpretation and articulation of the findings of the research? And then, and only then, once we've gone through that rigor, making sure everything is nicely polished, that we've got the appropriate referencing style to our discipline area, that we put commas in the right places, the final touches then are just a light dust of essentially revising the edited version of our revised final research project. And of course, at that moment, it's time to submit the project. So as you can see, the process is involved, and there are micro categories of consideration within each incremental moment within this process. And so my top tip, I suppose, that isn't mentioned on screen here is, of course, time management, to make sure that, we see when we need to submit the final research project, and part of that process planning out when we're going to make these incremental stages, and realistically how long would you need to take in order to complete successfully these incremental stages as well. And you may want to use the Gantt chart as a medium to articulate your time management. But it's not time management that is the core focus for today. Of course, it is about different types of approaches, methodology and methods. What's the difference? And here is where I'm going to focus on. So methodology is the rationale behind your research and the lens through which you will analyze your results. Some examples include the following. Phenomenology here describes the lived experience of a phenomenon. Ethnography looks at culture and the social norms and behaviours of a group. And action research is where the researcher systematically looks at a problem and tries various solutions to see how effective they are. So this is methodology. Now, here the core point is the rationale behind your research. I want to emphasize that, and the lens through which you will analyze your results. Now, of course, what you see here on screen are a number of potential approaches, and of course these will have broader considerations such as potentially social economic considerations and approaches and such like. But these are just initial start points for you really as a prompt to think about, well, methodology, what is this? But methods, I suppose in contrast but in intertwined connection, are the tools you will use to carry out your research. For example, a survey or questionnaire, a focus group, a case study, structured interviews, a controlled experiment. And so, if you like, methodology is the rationale, and the methods are essentially the tools of practical application. In summary, then, the methodology is how you will answer your research question, and the method is what you do to collect your data. That's the distinction, okay? And as I say, so often this terminology is so fluidly applied, but there are core distinctions, and I think these distinctions really help you to distill your approach and the way you think about your own research and how you're going to consider your topic area. Now, here, in terms of considerations, there are two major research paradigms, according to Cresswell, 2003, that you may consider as part of your research approach, and this is qualitative and quantitative. Okay, now these aren't the only considerations of how to approach your research area, but these are the two of which I'm going to discuss here that are particularly pertinent. Cresswell is absolutely right here. These are the two major paradigms. Qualitative research questions usually aim to explore a question with no set hypothesis beforehand. A qualitative approach is more about gaining in-depth insight than it is about empirical generalization that can be applied to, say, a population. The design then of a qualitative studies include the following: naturalistic, that looks at real world situations as they unfold naturally, and there is a lack of preset limitations and findings. Another aspect is emergent, where the researcher is open to adjusting their research question and methods to pursue new lines of inquiry as they emerge. Now, in contrast then, quantitative research questions usually contain a hypothesis and or try to predict something. And so the approaches include descriptive, how much, how often; comparative, what is the difference between; and relationship based, what is the relationship between X and Y. So quantitative studies are characterized by tools that are carefully designed before data is collated. Okay, larger sample sizes and the ability to be replicated. Okay, so as you can see here, these two approaches that are the two core paradigms that are used within research are qualitative and quantitative. Now, simply spoken, then, we could say that quantitative is something that is measurable. And what I find really useful is this paradigm distinction, which is drawn from McIntosh and O'Gorman 2015, just to kind of give the top tips or top ways in which we can analyze these two paradigms. But throughout your research, you may think, well, which paradigm is appropriate for your research area? And again, please do talk to your advisor about this, because it could be that mixed methods is applicable to your research. But again, even a mixed methods approach, we need to make sure that we fully understand the paradigmatics construct of those approaches. So before you decide which paradigm will best fit your research question, think about what you want to know and the nature of your research question. And this is where, research questions are absolutely core in setting the framework of response and methodological consideration and methods that will be utilized within your research project. So further in the point there, how you want to collect your data and who you are as a researcher. Now, I think here, we all have different ways of approaching material, and the way in which we approach material will be enhanced through some of the paradigmatic constructions that we see here through either the quantitative or the qualitative. So the positivist paradigm includes focus on facts, looking for causality and fundamental laws, reduce phenomena to simplest elements, formulate hypotheses and test them, operationalize concepts so that they can be measured, take large samples. The more qualitative in nature includes the interpretivist paradigm, and this is focus on meaning or meanings. Try to understand what is happening, look at the totality of each situation, develop ideas through induction from the data, use multiple methods to establish different views of phenomenon. And this is what I was talking about earlier in the slides, in terms of various methods which could be used in order to formulate articulation. Small samples investigated in depth over time, and hopefully these paradigms here on screen has helped you draw upon core distinctions. So, in order to choose a methodology, essentially we need to start with a research question. Okay, so think about your research question, what information you need to address. And I think in order to set, as I mentioned on the previous slide, in order to set a research question, you need to do some groundwork. You need to kind of consider what is being said within your field of study, not only just to potentially find a gap or find a point of it of entry that will formulate your articulation of the question, but also to consider the leanings of the methodologies and the methods being utilized by scholarship pertinent to your field of study as well. That groundwork will certainly form the base of which and how you will potentially address your own research area. So think about your research question and what information you need to address it. So considerations include what kinds of data would help you answer this question, how would you want to present your results. So doing that groundwork and essentially asking these two fundamental questions, the very basic simple points of departure here, will actually help you in a reflective way consider, right, okay, this is where myself as a researcher tend to lean towards, and this is the type of researcher that I am, and these will be the methods or methodological considerations that I will take in order to perform this research. This is what I'm looking for. If it is a more exploratory approach you are after, such as working to understand a phenomena or the behaviors and experience of a group of people, a qualitative paradigm might give the best results. If, for example, you want to look for correlations, comparisons, relationships, or trends, a quantitative paradigm might work better for you. So, once again, here just drawing upon the subtle distinctions between those two approaches and how you may engage with those approaches, not only in just in the think point of your question articulation, but also, formulated based on your broader reading and research of other areas. And so qualitative and quantitative research questions differ in approach, and here are some examples of both of those paradigms. So what are UK university students' experiences trying to eat healthy on campus? How can expressive writing improve the mental health of incarcerated women in the US? What are UK secondary school students' perceptions about gender differences in mathematics intelligence? And so these are the types of questions that you could canvass for a qualitative approach. Quantitative examples include a descriptive approach. How regularly do UK online postgraduate students use optional academic support resources? A comparative approach. What is the difference in daily calorie intake between men and women in London? And a relationship-based question could look like this. What is the relationship between job satisfaction and salary amongst expatriate workers? And so, as I say, the way in which we articulate our question identifies our approach, okay, and the subcategories within the paradigms of which we see here in terms of qualitative and quantitative. Now, I do appreciate this is quite a lot to take on board, and it may be really useful for obviously for you to consider these approaches, but have a fuller discussion with your advisor. That's what they're there for. They'll be delighted to discuss this with you. So examples of the qualitative methods include face-to-face interviews of participants. A moderate approach could be 30-minute interview, a more in-depth construction, 45 minutes. And these, the mode of interface interviews could include structured, semi-structured, or unstructured approaches. Your study focus group could be, I suppose, between 60 to 120 minutes. And of course, other approaches include a case study, observation, and textual analysis. And so this is just, if you like, a highlight of some of the approaches that you may take when it comes down to the practical approaches of your research. But what I would like to consider here is the planning to take a qualitative approach, and to consider, do you feel confident conducting interviews or focus groups? Although there are other possibilities, these tools are fundamental to this approach, to the qualitative approach. And so you may think, well, actually, I think this is my approach. This is the paradigm of which I would like to take. But these are the implications of that paradigm, and it's making sure, in actual fact, that those various tendencies of that approach are achievable and applicable to your study. So be reflective, I suppose, at an early stage. Do you recognise your role as a researcher and what that involves? You know, with a qualitative approach, the researcher accepts that data gathering analysis is a value-laden process, and so really think about, you know, what the procedural elements of this particular paradigm. So some of the pitfalls or common pitfalls of the approach for students planning to use intervals and or focus groups, be aware of the following: equipment failure, environmental hazards, as well as transcription errors. And these are fundamental. The research on this level, and certainly at postgraduate level, needs to be very sharp, succinct, articulate, and precise, because obviously any research that you're doing here will have a further impact in terms of articulation and dissemination. And so do be mindful, make sure you do some groundwork here, make sure your equipment's working. Think of environmental hazards, make the environment as distraction free as possible and as comfortable as possible as well. Transcription errors, be careful when transcribing material, as a misinterpretation can change the essence of what has been said. So also beware of colloquialism, jargon, or slang. Make sure that we're not making assumptions about perhaps some of the colloquialisms or jargon that have been referred to. Make sure it's very clear what meaning is being conveyed. Now, a further approach that you may want to look at is being had here. As you can see, the material is drawn from Kirsten, Iston, McComish, and Greenberg. And you just may, 2000 here, you may just want to have a quick look at the resource there, just for kind of further top tips. But anyway, these are some of the core ones. Now, examples of quantitative methods include a survey involving analysis of primary data collated using a structured questionnaire, statistical analysis of people's health data, for example, comparison between two data sets, and analysis of population trends. However, even responses given in words can be turned into numbers and analysed, like responses on the Likert scale and numerical responses to surveys. So here, once again, are further ways in which, or micro elements of which need to be considered or could be considered if you're using quantitative methods. So, planning to take a quantitative approach, well, you need to consider, well, how many responses will you need for your survey questionnaire to produce statistically significant findings? Do you feel confident carrying out statistical analysis? Because it obviously is a core element. And will you have access to and be able to use some kind of statistical software? And one such software includes SPSS. But like with the other approach that I was talking about in qualitative, what are the pitfalls, common pitfalls of quantitative approach? Well, these could include not asking enough people. Too few participants makes it difficult to produce statistically significant findings. Treating raw data like validated statistics, using open-ended questions. A poorly designed survey, of course, will impact, of course, our findings too. So let's unpick this a little bit more closely. So treating more data like validated statistics, numerical data, needs to be interpreted and verified to be meaningful. If we use open-ended questions, these are difficult to quantify. A poorly designed survey, here we need to be really sure that your questions are clear, free of bias or confusing language, and account for all possible answers. And so once again, there's quite an involved process involved in the articulation of whether it's the qualitative approach or the quantitative approach. And we just need to be sure that we are constructing appropriate tools and constructions in order to be as we approach our research final project. But all final research projects need to include considerable points, and one core point is the ethical consideration of your research design. So when designing your study, keep any potential ethical concerns on conflicts of interest in mind. Your advisor can help you think about the research design and guide you through the ethical approval process. And so some of the points of consideration is participant vulnerability, nature of the topic, consent, confidentiality and anonymity, method for collating data, and researcher vulnerability. Please note we do have a separate presentation devoted to ethical research design and ethical approval process. I'm just referring it to here as a fundamental part of the process of your research design. And so please do take this on board. So what I'd like to do now is just to give a summary and some top tips, okay? The goal is to make sense of your data and to relate it back to your research question and how it addresses a gap in the literature and within the broader topic research area, okay? So that goes back to what I was saying earlier. Be flexible in how you gather information, how you understand and interpret that data. And I think really in order to consider this top tip, it needs to be very clear within yourself what the approaches are, what are the methodologies, what are the methods. And although I've used the language theory and theoretical, I haven't really discussed those much or broadly here. My focus here has been purely methods and methodology, but do be mindful of the very broad canvas of methodological as well as method tools that you could utilize as a researcher. And as I say, I've just discussed just some micro elements in this presentation. Check that you will be able to obtain permission to access the data and to use the findings freely. That's crucial as well. Check that the analysis hasn't already been done and reported elsewhere. So in other words, be sure that what you're doing is providing essentially a contribution to the field of study. Remember that you cannot collect any data until after you have ethical approval. You will likely end up with more data that you know what to do with. This is certainly the case. And so sometimes there are certain things that we need to, or certain decisions that we need to make as a researcher. So do avoid the temptation to just write it all down. Your analysis of the data is absolutely crucial. But I think my absolute top tip here is your advisor is there to help you throughout the research process. Furthermore, there are academic skills tutor like myself. Just to mention again, I'm Dr. Sam Newington and I'm located in the Writing Centre, and we're there to help you at every step of your journey as well. So do please reach out to your advisor, who is the principal point of contact for your research, but do obviously feel free, if you've got any academic skills query, to reach out to us as well. It'd be delighted to hear from you. And so here I appreciate that this is a recorded session, but I do think, it's important that you reach out if you do have any questions that I've raised in the presentation today, or if you would like further clarity or for me to expand upon a point, please don't hesitate to contact me. I can be found in the Writing Centre, and it's always a delight to hear from you. If you have any questions about how to approach your research, please do reach out to your advisor as well. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy your research.